Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Bava Batra Daf Samach Bet. This week's learning is sponsored by Rav Asi, Jaffe and family in loving memory of her father, Mickey Moreb, Moshe Yaakov Ben, Rabbi David, Alav Shalom, on his 11th year at Tzeit. My father was a humble man of incredible honesty and integrity. He never spoke Lashon Hara, and though his Cheder studies were cut short by World War II, he supported and encouraged Torah learning for his children and others throughout his lifetime. We're going to get started now with our daf. We're going to continue with situations where somebody sold something to somebody else without being perfectly clear about what was included and what wasn't. And particularly, we're going to be dealing a lot with boundaries today. And we're going to try to assess what was intended by the sale. So starting with the top of our daf, matzar lo metzer echad aroch u metzer echad katzar. If on one side, it was Ruth's field, let's say on the north, and on the south side, it was Naomi's field. But Naomi's field on the south was, let's just say, half the length of Ruth's on the north. So if, let's say, it was 50 cubits long on the north and 25 cubits long was the border of Naomi on the south, and you said against Ruth and against Naomi. So the question is it 50 across? Is it 25 across? Or is it something in between? So what exactly is going to be the size of his field, and what's the shape of the field that we're discussing? So Amar Rav, lo kana ela keneged hakatzal. Rav says you basically end up with a rectangle or a square, depending on what size it is, which is basically going to extend from the point until the end of until the end of Naomi's field, the shorter one on the south side, and then just draw a line going toward that point in Ruth's field. So basically, you'll end up with not going the full border all the way over to Ruth. Okay, if you're having trouble visualizing this, there's a lot of pictures. If you have a regular Gemara in front of you or a Schattenstein, you'll have diagrams of all this. In the Koran, they have some diagrams for some of the cases in today's daf, but not all of them. So basically, this just means the line from, right? If you call Ruth's field, let's just think of, the way we do in geometry, A, B, C. B is the point that matches Ruth at the bottom. There's Naomi's at the bottom, which is A, B. So basically, you're going to have from A, B, right? In the north and AB in the south, and we're going to ignore the BC line of Ruth's entirely. That's Rav. Amrule Rav Kahana Rav Asi Rav. But Rav Kahana Rav Asi come and say to Rav, I don't understand. Why don't you do ABC at the top and then AB at the bottom and draw a line from B to C, right? B of Naomi's to C of Ruth's, and basically end up simply with a trapezoid. So again, if you're having trouble visualizing, we're going to go all the full length of Ruth's at the north to Naomi's at the south and draw a diagonal line from the end of Naomi's to the end of Ruth's, and we're good. And that's going to be our field, and then you're going to actually get more. And that's what they said to Rav. Rav's reaction was shatik Rav. He didn't know what to say. He was silent, which could mean he agreed with them, but it doesn't seem to mean he agreed with them, because we're going to see now that he comes up with one case where he's going to agree with them, but doesn't sound like he really agrees with them. He just didn't really have a good response to them. Umod Rav, but Rav would agree. But if Reuven and Shimon lived on the northern border, okay, so AB was Reuven, BC was Shimon, and then Levi and Yehuda lived at the bottom. So, right, you'll have EF and GH. Okay, so AB is opposite EF, and BC is opposite FG. So, and you said Reuven and Shimon at the north, which is ABC. And then you have EF, right? What did I say? AB, maybe I said it wrong. ABC, basically, AB and BC. And at the bottom, you're going to have, let's just change it a little, okay? DE and EF. So if you said, so now if you just said Reuven and Shimon, which is ABC all the way, and you said only Levi at the bottom, in that case, since, right, you said DE and you didn't say EF, okay? Then, midahava le'lemichtav de Reuven keneged Levi, and they have in parentheses de Shimon keneged Yehuda, but really what they meant is if you really only meant, like Rav said, which is AB and DE, right, just that first section, well, then you should have just said Reuven and Levi. You shouldn't have said Reuven, Shimon on one side and Levi at the bottom, because that doesn't make any sense. So in that case, he would agree, right? Since you didn't say that, I'm getting rid of the words of Shimon keneged Yehuda. Some people take that out. Okay, it doesn't really make sense because it's enough to just say you should have just said Reuven against Levi. and you didn't, Shma Mina Kenega Rosh HaTor Hu Da'amar Le. That case, since you did say the entire thing on the north and only half of it on the south, when you have 4 different people and you could have just said one, right, number 1 and number 3, instead of number 1 and number 2 opposite number 3, right, cutting out number 4, it must mean that you really meant to just cut out number 4, and you really did mean it to be a trapezoid shape, drawing from the end of Shimon's property to the end of Levi's property. Metzer Reuven Mizrach u'Ma'arav, u'Metzer Shimon Tzafon v'Darom. Let's say you have Reuven living on the east and the west border. Your field, this field that you're selling, borders Reuven's on both sides, on the east and the west, and Shimon's on the north and the south. So instead of having Reuven and Shimon opposite each other, you actually have a property of Reuven's opposite a property of Reuven's, and a property of Shimon opposite the property of Shimon. And you say the border is Reuven and Shimon, but you weren't clear about which Reuven and Shimon you're talking about. The east or the west for Reuven, and the north or the south for Shimon. So the question is, right, did you include both or not? So now they say, and you have to remember, the default is always, and that's really why Rav ruled in the beginning, you're only going to get half, because the default is, or again, half, it's not clear, it's necessarily half, assuming Naomi's property was half of Ruth's, but we're going to always assume that the buyer is going to get the least because if you want to get something out of someone else's possession, the burden of proof relies on you. So you're going to have to prove more. And that's why Rav didn't want to go with the trapezoid in the first place, unless when it's a case where it's really clear. So now they're going to suggest, okay, that Metzer Reuven Mizrach u'Ma'arav u'Metzer Shimon Tzafon v'Darom. So now you have both on both sides. But you just said the border is Reuven and Shimon, but you didn't say which border is the border on Reuven and which one of Shimon. So tzarech lemichtav le, if you want to be able to, the buyer, claim the entire piece of land, you have to make sure it's written in the contract, Metzer Reuven ruchin trein, the border is Reuven on both sides, u'Metzer Shimon ruchin trein, and the border of Shimon is on both sides. If you didn't specify it's on both sides, then we assume the smallest amount. We're going to assume you just meant Reuven and Shimon on one side. And then you're going to end up, if you look at the diagrams, you end up with basically, if let's say it's a circle, it's a square, the property, or even a rectangle, you're going to end up with just a triangle of, you're not going to be able to prove as a buyer any more than half the property drawn as a triangle, because you said it's got Reuven and Shimon, which one is on, let's say, right, either east and south, or east and north, or west and north, right? But you're going to basically only be able to prove one side of Reuven and one side of Shimon, and then we're going to draw an angle, right, a line, diagonal, cutting off, and basically saying you get only half the field, a triangle's worth. Abaye. Now they start with a series of questions. Siem lo et hakhanot ma. What if you just designated the corners? Okay, if you have a Gemara, you can look at the pictures. Corners would mean, okay, you said the corner of this field, the corner of that field, the corner of that, the corner of that. Now, either you mean the entire field and you just designated the 4 corners, which would then say everything included inside, or perhaps what you meant is a strip of land. Now, the minimum size of a field is something that you can grow 9 kav of, right, that you can plant 9 kav of seeds. So perhaps we just mean a strip going from one corner to the other, and then the other corner to the other corner, meaning 2 diagonal strips, making an X in the field. And that's what you meant by the corners, a strip of the field going from one corner to the opposite corner, and a strip of field going from one corner to the opposite corner. There's a few different interpretations of how to read this, but that's the basic. We'll go with that interpretation here. And that's a question. Mahu, what's the halacha? We're going to see in the end that we don't have an answer to these questions. Kimin gam mahu. What if you did it like a gamma? Gamma is a Greek letter. It's kind of like a kaf sofit, okay, which it's really more like a resh, okay, but they often call it a gamma, which is shaped actually like a kaf sofit, or like an L, or something like that, okay? So a resh and L, they're all kind of the same. Where what it basically means is you designated the corner, one corner on one end and one corner on the far end. And then, second, let me just check something. Right, see it, right. So in that case, Here you did two opposite corners, basically, because you designated, right? It's like saying the tip of the L in both, right? The edges of the L. So then the question is, do you only get a strip in between those two? Or do you again assume that this is just designating two outer borders when there's also two on the other sides? And what we really mean is everything in between. So that's the second question. The third question is, Biserugin mahu. Okay, what if you had, now there's different interpretations here, but let's go with there were 8 fields that surrounded it, okay? We have basically 1, 2, right? 1 at the top, 1 second, we have 1, make sure I have this right, 1 at the top, and then, right, 1 in each of the 4 corners, and then on each side, there's 1 in between. So altogether 8, because you have, right, 1 at the top, another 1 in the middle, and then 1 in the corner, and then 1 below, and then 1 in the corner, and then 1 next to it, 1 in the corner, 1 above, next to it in the corner, okay, if you go around. So you have 8 fields surrounding, and Beserugin, you basically took every other field, okay, and you said, this one, not that one, this one, not that one, this one, not that one, okay, again, there's some different interpretations of exactly how this works. Oh, you know what, this one, actually, this one doesn't have to have the 8 like that. This one could just be, right, that really explained more the corners, okay? And in that case, when we did the previous case of the corners, you basically skipped over the person who owned the one in between, right? So then you did these 4 corners, and that was the case of the first case of the corners. But Beserugin is you have 2, and then 2, and then 2, and then 2. So every side has 2. But you basically skipped over each one. So you said Reuven, but then not Shimon. Levi, not Yehuda. Okay, and each time you skipped. So the question is again, were you lazy and didn't want to mention all 8 of them? So you just skipped and basically meant I'm including everything. Or did you mean just, and then we would draw basically triangles, okay? And you can see the picture in the Rashbam here of these triangles. And then basically you would end up with every other triangle because every square of, let's say, right, it's Reuven and Shimon. So, and let's say Levi, Yehuda on the sides. So since you skipped every person, each square, we divide the whole field into these 8 squares. So each square you would get half of it because you would have the part that's bordering on Shimon, right, at the top, and then not Reuven. And then the next one would be Yehuda, let's say, on the side, and then that would have a triangle, which, again, the whole side of Yehuda would be in, but on the inside, it would be more of a triangle because you didn't get the whole bordering side of Shimon that was right next to Yehuda. Okay, so I'm just using names randomly. It doesn't really matter. The point is whatever was next to it, you got one and not the other, so then we'd have to take that square that's made up of those 2 people and basically say you're only getting half of it and the half that sides with the side of the person that you mentioned. So you'd end up in the end with these 4 triangles within this field out of 8, and you would have half the field, but you would end up with little chunks of the field, which would be a little strange. But again, why else would you have designated these borders b'seirugin? And again, that's the question. Or maybe you really meant the entire thing. So let's just review because I kind of wasn't clear in some of the cases before. But siyem lo atakranot, we just mentioned the fields that were at the borders of, right, the corners of the fields when presumably the strips in between the corners were owned by other people. Then did you just mean the land from corner to corner? And that's why actually we would make it an X, because you were saying I didn't own the part that was owned by the strip in between the corners. Sounds a little like a game of Othello. Okay, anyway, Kimingam Mahu, where you did opposite corners, 2 opposite corners, right, on the diagonal, and then would you just get a strip of the middle or maybe the whole thing? And then B'seirugin, which would be, again, field on one side, field on the other, right? 2 different owners on each side. And you skipped over each one. Would you end up with just a triangle, which was just the border of that, right? Just bordering on that person's field. But then as it goes into the middle, it would be narrower. You wouldn't really get the whole section because you're basically saying, I didn't have the field. I didn't mention the guy on that side. Or again, does it mean the whole field? Okay, moving on to more cases. Matzalo metzer rishonu, metzer sheni, metzer shlishi. Now we're going to have a big debate here about this case. You basically said, okay, the strip, there were mitzarim. A metzer is basically a border. It's a strip, right? A strip that's sits on the border. So you said, here's the border on this side, here's the border on that side, here's the border on that side. But metzer revi lo matzar, but you did lo matzar lo. You didn't mention what the border is on the fourth side. So now the big question is, Amar Rav, kana hakol. Well, if field 1 and 3, right, extended out all the way to metzer 4, okay, then we're going to assume it ends at the end of 1 and 3, right? In other words, you have 1, 2, 3. So 2 is opposite 4, 1 is opposite 3. So it goes as far as the first person's, right, the border on the first field, and the third field as far as that goes out, which basically we're going to assume. Now here's going to be a big deliberation as we go on, but right now we're going to assume, right, we go up to the end of 1 and 3, which basically includes the fourth boundary. So, or maybe not, and we're going to see. Amarav, kana hakol chutz mi metzer revi. Rav says, since you didn't mention that strip as a border, it doesn't include the strip on the fourth side because you didn't mention it. So if you would have mentioned it, then obviously it would be included. You didn't mention it, it means you were excluding it. Shmuel amar afilu metzer revi. Shmuel says, no, that strip on the fourth side, of course it's included because it's just part of, now again, it's unclear whether it was within boundary of 1 and 3 or not exactly, but we're going to say he includes that because he just assumes if there's these strips that designate borders and you designated, but what they really mean here, this is a little different from the others where we said you're bordered on Reuven, you're bordered on Shimon, all that. This seems to be a strip of land that was used as a border. And you said you're getting the border on the first side, you're getting the border on the second side, you're getting the border. That border is included in your property, but you didn't mention the fourth border. Okay, so this sounds a little different than the other cases because it sounds like there's strips of border that we're actually talking about. At least that's the way some understand this case. So Rav says, you didn't mention that fourth border. Obviously, you meant not to include it. And Shmuel says, what do you mean? You mentioned 3. It was obvious the fourth was included as well, and therefore it's included. And Rav Asi says, a third opinion, lo kana ela telamachal panei kula. Since you mentioned these strips of the border on 3 sides, and you didn't mention the fourth, you actually don't even acquire the whole field. Okay, until now we thought, of course you get the whole field. Now, the part in between all these border strips. But Rav Asi says, what do you mean? If you wanted to say you get the whole field, you would have given all 4 boundaries. The fact that you didn't means you must be leaving something over. And not just the fourth boundary, but the whole field other than a row on each side. In other words, you said this border strip, that border strip, that meant you get a little more than just the border strip because what it means, the border strip you can't plant on, or maybe you can't plant on, or it's not usually so sizable. But what it means is I'm giving you a strip under the border or next to the border, right? Within these 3 boundaries, you'll get a strip of land that's enough of a row, a furrow to, 1 row to plant your stuff. So now they say, so we have these 3 opinions. Let's just review. Rav says you get everything except the fourth border strip. Shmuel says you get even the fourth border strip. And Rav Asi says you don't even get most of the field, you just get a row in each side. So now they say Rav Asi, Rav Amar Shiur. He holds like Rav theoretically. Rav was basically saying the fact that you didn't mention the fourth border means you're holding something back. He just goes much farther, is to say you're even holding back the field. So since you were already holding back that strip at the border, you must have been also holding back much more, which is most of the field, just not, right? It's all the field that's opposite that border, right? Just not this 1 row in each place. Amar Rava. So now those are these 3 opinions. The question is, who do we hold like? So Rava comes in a later generation and tells us what the halacha is. And he's going to get much more into detail, and we're going to have 2 versions of Rava, and then we're going to have the Gemaras, or it's going to see it's really not the Gemara, at least according to the Ramban, the Ritva, and the Ran, it was actually an addition of a Gaon. We're talking many hundreds of years later, where one of the Gaonim had a comment, Rav Yehudai Gaon added this kind of comment about these 2 versions of Rava, about the Gemara, and you'll see why they seem to say it's Rav Yehudai Gaon, because it seems like a totally different style, not typical of the Gemara. Anyway, that's what we're going to have for this section. So 2 versions of Rava, and then a comment about these 2 different versions, like what they both agree about and what they actually disagree about. So I'm a Rava. Hilchata, after we saw these 3 opinions, Rava paskins like this. Kahana kol chutz mimetzer revi, which sounds like he's holding like Rav, which is you get everything, but not that fourth border strip. But lo amaran ela de lo mivla. But by the way, you don't get the fourth strip if it's not, and this is what I was having trouble explaining before, because we're going to see this all different ways of reading this, if it's not absorbed within the boundaries of 1, 2, and 3, really 1 and 3, okay? Because assuming, right, we go 1 is north, let's say, 2 is west, 3 is south, and then 4 is the east side. So if the fourth side is absorbed within, if that eastern border is within the north and the south side, then, well, then of course you acquire the fourth side because it's within the boundaries. So that's what he says first. If it's absorbed within the boundaries, kanat, then of course you acquire it. Now, another condition that he says, when we say it's not absorbed, if it's not absorbed within the boundaries, then Rava holds like Rav, who basically says you don't get the fourth boundary strip. Well, that's only if it's significant enough. What would make it significant enough? Well, di'ika ale richba didikla. It has to be, number one, have a boundary of palm trees on it and a space that you can actually plant 9 kav of seeds. If you can't plant 9 kav of seeds and it doesn't have this boundary, these palm trees on it, then it's not its own section, really. If it's not its own section, it's obviously absorbed and counted. It's obviously considered, I shouldn't say the word absorbed. It's not absorbed within the boundaries. It's a little bit separate, but it's not significant enough on its own to be anything of importance. And therefore, of course, you included it in the sale. So basically, if it's absorbed within the boundaries, it's included in the sale no matter what, even if you didn't mention the fourth boundary. If it's not included, but yet it doesn't have its own space in and of itself that's important, then it's also going to be included in the sale because you're not going to leave over something that's totally insignificant. Okay, so that's the first reading of Rava. And then he says, but if it's not significant enough, and it's not 9 kav, then of course it's koneh, as we just said. Michlal. So what can you infer from this first reading of Rava? If it is absorbed, now they're making one more jump. If it is absorbed, and right, if it's within the boundaries of 1 and 3, border number 4 and border strip, and we said no matter what, it's going to be in the sale because it's within the boundaries. Sounds like it doesn't matter whether, right, whether or not it has the boundary here, right, the strip of trees, and you can plant 9 kav, that's an insignificant detail. Because once it's absorbed, according to this reading, Rava thinks it's definitely included, even though you didn't mention. So whether it has or doesn't have is an irrelevant factor. The only time it becomes a relevant factor is if it's outside the boundaries. If it's outside the boundaries, it really depends. If it can stand on its own, then you didn't include it in the sale. If it can't stand on its own, you must have included it in the sale. That's all the first version. Ika de Amri, but some people say that Amarava, Hilchata, Kana, Kol, Afilu, Metzer, Revi. So that's so far as the same. You acquire everything, and even the Metzer, sorry, I messed that up. Rava says the opposite here. In the first version, Rava said, Kana, Kol, Chutz, Mi, Metzer, Revi. You acquired everything other than the fourth boundary, but then we said that's only if it's not absorbed and only if it's got its own significance. Now we're going to go the reverse. The halacha is kana hakol afilu metzer revi. According to Rava, you actually acquire everything, even the fourth boundary. And however, though, we're going to modify this as well. And then we're going to end up, even though these two things start off opposite each other, one said don't acquire the fourth, and the other said you do acquire the fourth. But once we start with these modifications, we're going to see there's not a huge difference. And that's exactly what Rav Yehudai Gaon is going to point out. There's not such a big difference between them. Both versions agree on a few basic things, but they disagree about the following, and we'll get back to that. Now, let's just read. The lo amaran, however, the fact that the fourth border will be included is only if, you can try to guess what they're going to say, ela de mivla, only if it's absorbed. then it will be included. Already now you can see this is just like the first version, because the first version was it's not included unless it's absorbed within the borders of 1 and 3. So this is also saying that if it's absorbed though, right, of a lo mivla lo kani, if it will be, the fourth will be included if it's absorbed within the boundaries. If it's outside the boundaries though of 1 and 3, then it won't be included. However, again, the chimivla, but if it is absorbed, and then we're going to say, and therefore you would acquire it, nami lo amaran ela deleka ale richba didikla below avi tisha kabin. Well, that's only though if it doesn't have this border of the, right, this fence of palm trees, velo havi tisha kabin, and it's not 9 kav. You can't plant 9 kav there. Aval ika ale richba didikla v'havi tisha kabin lo kana. But when it is absorbed, and we say it's going to be included, that's only if it can't stand on its own. But if it could stand on its own, even if it's absorbed within the boundaries of 1 and 3, we don't include it. Okay, you don't get it. If whoever's buying it doesn't get it. Now, what can you infer from here? Michlal dechi lo muvla. If it's not absorbed though, and it's outside the boundaries, according to this version, this seems to imply, though, once it's outside the boundary, no way is it included no matter what. Whether it's significant on its own, it's not significant on its own, it's still not going to be part of the sale. Because the whole thing here is, this version, when it's absorbed, it has to, in order to be included in the sale, it has to be not significant enough, right? If it had its own ability that you could plant in it, then of course the owner didn't include it in the sale. Well, then of course, if it's outside the borders, for sure, nobody thinks it's included in the sale according to this version. So now, Sham'ina mitravayu lishane de Rava. Now here comes the line that according to some of the Sephardi Rishonim, the Ramban, the Ran, the Ritva, they all say that this part was included, was said by Rav Yehudai Gaon. It's not really part of the actual Gemara. And like I said before, you'll see why. It's a bit of a different type, because now what they're going to do is, and in case it was a little confusing, because it was a little confusing, this last section, Sham'ina mitravayu lishane de Rava. Now he's going to say, both these versions agree on a few basic things. Number one, dibisadeh lo shiur v'lo midi. Against Rav Asi, if you remember, who said you only designated 3 boundaries, right? 3 strips on those sides, then you only get a row in each. You don't get the field at all. Forget about the 4th boundary. You don't even get most of the field. Well, neither version of Rava thinks that. Well, both versions of Rava think that you get the field. It's just the metzer, that strip on the 4th side, you might not get. And Shamina Nami, and the other thing that all of them agree about, both versions, is Hecha de Mivla, Veleka ale Richba de Dikla, Velo Avitisha Kabin Kana. If it's absorbed within boundaries 1 and 3, right, that 4th strip, and it's not significant enough on its own, that strip, that 4th strip, both versions think that you acquire it. Lo Mivla. Now, the question is, where do they disagree, though, on the next 2 points? If it's Lo Mivla, if it's not absorbed, and ika ale richba didikla v'havitisha kabin lo kana. Sorry, this is something they also both agree about. My mistake. We're not up to that yet. If it's not absorbed within the 3 boundaries, and this is a strip that stands outside of that, and it's not significant enough because it doesn't have this strip of, right, this fence, and you can't plant there 9 kav, well then, for sure that's excluded from the sale. Everybody agrees that Rava holds by that, both versions of Rava. Here come the disagreement. Mivla ve'ika ale, or lo mivla ve'leka ale, if it's absorbed and yet it can stand, right, it's enough to plant in, it's got the 9 kav and all that, or it's not absorbed, but it's not significant enough on its own, you can read them in both directions, meaning you can explain it one way, you can explain it the other way, meaning different versions of Rava, we don't know whether it's included, whether it's not included. Again, let's just review. If it's not absorbed, but right, it's lo mivla, and yet it has its own, it's not absorbed, but yet it's not significant enough to stand on its own, or it is absorbed, but it's significant to stand on its own. There's 2 opposite cases. So since it goes this way, some people say Rava said this way, and some people say Rava said that way. We don't know who it goes to. Does it go to the buyer, or does it not go to the buyer? Did you mean to include it in the sale? Did the seller mean to include it in the sale? Or did the seller not mean to include it in the sale? What do we do? In this case, shuda dedaine. What's shuda dedaine? We leave it at the judge's discretion. The judges get to decide. Now, shuda dedaine sometimes means, right, there's a debate. Every time we see shuda dedaine, does it mean the judges can just decide arbitrarily, or does it mean the judges make their best educated guess based on what they think the person would mean here, what the seller really meant? And most people think that in this case, even if they think in other cases, it's unclear, they might think sometimes it's arbitrary. In this case, they seem to say, most people think that, most of the commentaries think that what we mean here is they try to assess really what the seller means. Was the seller a generous kind of seller and therefore included it, or not a generous kind of stingy seller and therefore kept it back for him or herself? Okay, so that was, again, how did we start on this side of the page? We started with these three boundaries, but you didn't talk about the fourth boundary, strip. And then the question is, that fourth strip included or not? Do you even get the whole field? We saw Rav Asi's opinion. We saw Rav and Shmuel about whether the fourth side is included. Then we saw Rava's psak, which was either the fourth side is included or the fourth side isn't included. But then we saw that the two versions weren't so far off because all agreed that the field for sure goes. The question is just about the fourth strip. And they agreed about, right, if it's absorbed and also not significant on its own, or if it's not absorbed and significant on its own. Both those cases, right, we view the opposite. It either is included, not included in the sale. And then the two in-between cases, which depended on which version of Raba you go by. Amar Raba, palga di'ile ba'ara, palga. Somebody is partners with somebody else in the field and then sells his portion in the following wording and says, palga di'ile ba'ara, I'm giving you half that I have in the field. Palga, you get half. Meaning, if I own half the field and I say, it sounds like I'm saying, I'm giving you my half. That's what I'm selling to you. So you get half the field. But if I say, palga ba'ara de'ile, if I say I'm giving you half of the field that I have, meaning half of my half, then you only get riva, you only get a quarter. That's Raba. Amarle Abaye, mashnahachi or mashnahachi. Abaye says, I don't know why you would differentiate. Because theoretically, all of them are really saying the half that I have, whether you say the half that I have or the half that I have, right? You could see how really it could be, it's all a matter of your tone and how you really said it. And this really could both mean the half that I have, meaning the person really gets half. So Abaye doesn't really like this distinction that Raba said, even though theoretically Raba makes a lot of sense, right? Because the half that I have is different from half of the land that I have, right? Half of what I have is half of half. If I say the half that I have, then it means the whole half that I have. But Abaye says, it doesn't necessarily have to be read that way. It could be theoretically all the time, either which way you're wording it, you're saying the half that I have, and therefore he goes against Raba. And Raba was silent when Abaye questioned him. So and then Amar Abaye, Ana Savre mid Ishti Kibule Kable. I thought when he was silent, he was accepting my opinion and agreed with me. But but in fact, that's not the case. Because Chazinu Hanishtari Denafke mi Mar, because I saw documents that came out of the house of Mar. Mar is the way Abaye always talks to Raba, because Raba adopted him, and therefore he always calls him with the term of respect of Mar. Viktiv b'hu hachi, and it says there the following. In other words, I saw shtarot that said, Palga di'ile ba'ara, Palga, and Palga ba'ara di'ile riva. I saw in these documents that Rav had, that people had written, and he ruled in them, that if it said it this way, he said it was half. And if he saw it written that way, if there were documents written that way, he ruled a quarter. And therefore, it seems he didn't really accept my opinion. And now we're going to have a similar thing that Raba says, and also Abaye disagrees and says, I don't know why you're distinguishing. I'm a Raba, and with this will end for today. Metzer ara demina palga. Now, if I gave borders on, let's say, the north and the south, and even the east, and then when I got to the western border, I said, and let's say, okay, let me be clear. I owned a big long field. Okay, let's just put it in a rectangular shape. It doesn't really matter. I'm just giving an example. And then I said that of this land that I have, I'm gonna, right, and it borders on Reuven and Shimon in the north and the south, let's say, and someone else on the west. And then I say, well, if you're and where I'm giving you the eastern boundary, it's going to be in the middle of my field. That's what we're going to say right now. Palga metzar ara demina palga. The metzar of this land on the east side is going to be from my land at the half point. Okay, so then palga. Then you're going to basically end up this rectangle of space where, we know 3 borders. We don't know the 4th. I say it's in the middle, so it's in the middle. But if I say metzar ara demina psika, if I say the boundary of the land from which I'm giving you a piece of, that's the psika, then tisha kabin, you only get the first 9 kav. Okay, meaning the smallest amount of a field that we can cut from this field, that would give you a place to plant 9 kavs worth, right, of seeds. Meaning we're going to give you the most minimum, because again, this is all based on hamotzim chaver alav haraya. If you want to claim you got more, well, then you have to prove it. And if I'm selling it to you and I said it's from this piece that I'm cutting of my field, I'm giving you a piece. A piece could be the smallest piece. So Abaye said, I don't understand. It should be the same for both. Now, same for both what? Well, right, we'll see in a minute, but what's the difference whether you say it this way or that way? And Ishti. And Raba again was silent. And now they're going to say Savramina. They thought when they heard this, that what Abaye was saying was Idi v'Idi palga, that both should get half. And in other words, no matter whether you say it, the piece I'm cutting, or the half, then either which way you should get half my field. Okay, but we're going to see tomorrow that perhaps that's not so clear. Okay, that's where we're ending today because that's where our daf ends. So let's just do a quick review. We started with the longer border and the shorter border, or the every other one, or the corners, or all these different cases where you weren't clear enough about how you designate the borders. And the question is, what did you include or not? And then we got to the more complicated cases of the 3 borders without the 4th. It's a little more complicated just because we had all these different opinions and then all these different versions of what Rava actually said. And then we had that additional section in the Gemara, which kind of summarized that section for us. And then we ended with these other cases of your wording or what you wrote in the document. And if you said this half versus a piece, or versus, half that I have or half of what I have, or right. And the question is, right, can we distinguish between those 2 languages? Rava thought yes, Abaye thought no. And we'll continue with the second case for the section in tomorrow's daf. Wishing everybody a good day.